So we'll start in 1 Samuel 9, chapter 9, verse 3. I just want to kind of give you a story here that I think is kind of interesting. This is half devotional, but it's also applies to the book of Judges to kind of help you to see what that world was like a little bit. Because sometimes when we think about the world of the Bible, these people are very big to us. These prophets and things, they have entire books of the Bible, and so now we know their names very well. We're very familiar with them. I mean, there's only, so many books of the Bible, and so we know them very well. But what I want you to see is that world was a little different when you're actually living through it. All right, so 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 3. Now the donkeys of Kish. This is a story where Saul's father loses his donkeys. Now the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. And so Kish said to Saul his son, and this is before Saul was king, right? Take one of the young men with you and arise and go look for the donkeys. And he passed through the hill country of Ephraim and passed through the land of Shalissa. Now keep in mind, he's from the tribe of Benjamin, so this is a significant journey for him if he's already passed through the land of Ephraim, right? So it's a whole other tribe over, so it's a fairly significant traveling here. Passed through the land of Shalissa, but they did not find them. And so they passed through the land of Shalim, but they were not there either. So they're looking all over the place for these donkeys. Then they passed through the land of Benjamin, but did not find them there either. And when they came to the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant who was with him, Come, let us go back, lest my father cease to care about the donkeys and become anxious about us. So he said, listen, we're not going to find these things. We stay gone too much longer. My father's going to be worried about us more than these donkeys that we've been looking for. And so he says, but a servant now says to him, Behold, there's a man of God in this city, and he is a man who is held in honor. All that he says comes true. So now let us go there. Perhaps he can tell us the way we should go. Then Saul said to his servant, But if we go, what can we bring the man? For the bread in our sacks is gone, and there's no present to bring the man of God. What do we have? And the servant goes on and talks to him about what they have. But what I want you to see is how they're talking about him. They say, I've heard that in this city there's a man of God, and people hold him in honor, and whatever he says tends to happen, right? Now, the person that they're talking about is Samuel, right? Now, Samuel was the leader of the nation, right? And they don't even know who he is. And they say, I've heard that there's this guy here in the city, and they don't even know his name. They didn't recognize him when they seen him. They didn't know who he was. But they had heard that there was a man of God in that city, and that the stuff that he says comes true. Now, this is Samuel, who was the judge of the nation. He had already led them to victory over the Philistines when the ark was returned. I mean, he's the one that helped get the ark back and all this kind of stuff, he was judged during that time period because it was under Eli, who was the high priest, that the ark was lost to the Philistines. So for a while, the Philistines had the Ark of the Covenant. And then later it gets returned. They didn't have it for very long. And so this same Samuel then leads the Israelites against the Philistines, and they have this great victory over them. And so Samuel is the leader. And every time that Samuel gets ready to do something, the whole nation, it seems like, if you read the text, you think the whole nation knew about him. And so here's Saul and this guy going, and they don't even know who he is. And so they just heard, I heard there's a man of God here. And so what I think is interesting about this is that because Samuel's so big to us, I mean, he's got 2 books of the Bible. We've talked about him quite a bit. He's the one that anointed David, and David was a very popular king, that we almost take for granted that everybody in the nation knew about it. Particularly in a nation like America, where how could you not know the president and the vice president,
People that don't.
Yeah, and there probably is still some people, in this country that maybe don't. Particularly now, we've had a bunch of new people come to the country recently. But in terms of somebody that, in our minds, I guess what I'm saying is we think of these judges as being larger than life, almost like how our president would be, that everyone in the country knows who they are. But according to this, Saul didn't even know who Samuel was. They just heard there was a man of God that people, held in honor that lived in that city. They didn't even know what his name was, and then he walked past them. They didn't even know it was him. And so it's just kind of interesting that in the real life of a community where there's not communication like what we have now, with phones, internet, television, news things, that it wasn't as prominent as we might think, that everybody just knew who these people were. Because if you're actually on the ground and you're just living in some small village and it's you and your family, I mean, you may not know what's going on 80 miles down the road. Month journey. Back then, people wouldn't make a journey from one side of the country to the other except for maybe once or twice in their life. I mean, think about walking 80 miles. I mean, with your family and all of your stuff. Or if you don't bring your stuff, then that means you got to leave your stuff unprotected or something in a place where there's no police, there's no protection. If somebody comes and finds your stuff, they'll just take it. And so it wasn't very common. And then, the mode of transportation was going to be walking, or perhaps you might have been rich enough to have some animal. And so, then it was dangerous, too, to go on these journeys, because it wasn't like here in America that everywhere you go, the people are American. It was there, there were villages of enemies all along the way. They didn't, I mean, you were the intruder in their land, and you're trying to take their land. And so just traveling all over the place was not something that probably a lot of people did. If they found a place that they could have, then they probably spent most of their time trying to farm and cultivate and provide some kind of defense for their own city, and they probably didn't spend a whole lot of time getting out. And so, with the exception of some of the later things, like where you have a king and everybody knows who that is, I think this period of the judges, it's entirely possible that they were not very well known in the way that we think a leader of a nation would be, right? For somebody like Saul to have not even heard of Samuel. I mean, after they've already gotten back the ark and done all these major battles and had all these victories and subdued the Philistines, and everybody looks to Samuel as their leader, and Samuel judged them for decades, and then and we know that this was the end, because this is the story that leads up to Samuel saying he's so old now that he has to pass it off to Saul. And here Saul has never even heard of him. And so Samuel must have been judging them for decades at this point. And they don't even know who he was. And it's not that, they call him a young man, but that Hebrew word for young man could be all over the place. It doesn't mean boy like what we would think. It just means younger man, like still fighting age. And the reason I believe that Saul was not very young, first of all, it would have been really foolish for his dad to send him all over the place if he was real young. But then second of all, one of the very next scenes after Saul's anointed king, his first battle, he doesn't start the battle. His first battle with the Philistines, they fight Amalek, but his first battle with the Philistines, if you remember, he doesn't fight the battle. Jonathan starts it. Jonathan climbs up the wall and picks a fight with the Philistines, and they have this big battle, and the Philistines end up wiping out themselves is what happened. So Jonathan goes up, starts this battle. He's fighting with just him and his armor bearer, but all the other Philistines in the camp hear that fighting is going on, and so they just start fighting against each other. That happened several times in the Bible, which tells you that not only did they not know who some of their judges were, that they didn't have uniforms, right? And some of them must have culturally looked fairly similar. Like if one tribe was black and the other tribe was white, that would never have happened, right? They would have known these are clearly our people and these are not. But the fact that they could have an entire army wiped itself out and they had never fought the enemy, and that happened 2 or 3 times in the Bible, and we're talking about armies of over 100,000 people, and everybody, war, what? And they start fighting people because they're scared, and they actually wipe themselves out, and the Israelites never even had to fight. And that happened a few times. So this is one of those stories. But the implication there is, though, it's Jonathan that starts it, which means Jonathan has been around, which means Saul was not a young boy when he started this. And so, because right after Samuel anoints him, he says, now you need to go lead these people into war. And it's Jonathan that does it. So when Saul is having these encounters, even though the Bible calls him a young man, I don't know that we can think boy in that instance, if Jonathan's already a fighting age, right? Okay. All right, let's go back to Judges, and we'll get started there. We'll kind of work our way through this book of Judges here. I got a couple things that we could talk about today. Maybe we'll start with Caleb. Caleb is kind of a central figure here in some of these opening chapters of Judges. And if you remember, Caleb was one of the spies, right? So there were 12 spies sent in during Moses' time. And 2 of them had a good report. 10 of them were fearful and talked the people out of going to fight. And when Moses is doing it, each of the 12 spies represented a tribe, right? So that's why there were 12 of them. There was one person who represented each tribe, right? Joshua represented Ephraim. So Ephraim was Joseph's tribe. Ephraim and Manasseh were Joseph's tribe. So they would have been, therefore, half, fill in the blank, Egyptian. Yeah. So these people, because Joseph's wife was Egyptian. And so Ephraim and Manasseh would have been half Egyptian and half Israelite. So Joshua was half Egyptian, their leader, which is kind of interesting. And so Joshua represents the tribe of Ephraim, and the other spy that had a good report was Caleb, and he represents the tribe of Judah. And so those were the only 2 that came back with a positive report. All right, so let's look here in Judges. We'll be in the first couple chapters. So first, let me just orient you a little bit. So if you have your Bible, you can look at this. Chapter 1 starts talking about the death of Joshua and how after Joshua, they still had to then go up and try and take some land, right? But then what I want you to see is that in chapter 2, like say verse 6, it starts talking about Joshua again, right? And it starts talking about how he dismissed everyone and all that. If you look at, just flip the page over to chapter 24 of Joshua, let me give you the exact verses here. That whole section of 14 through 28, when he says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That whole section, there are entire parts of that are word for word, basically, this section of chapter 2 of Judges, right? So when it talks about he was 110 when he died and all of that, that is almost a word for word copy out of the book of Joshua, right? And so chapter 1, I guess what I want you to see, is taking place after the death of Joshua, and then it kind of backtracks a little bit in chapter 2 and starts talking about some things that were going on while Joshua was still alive. This final covenant that Joshua has them do in chapter 24 of Joshua, where they come back and they redo the covenant, and that's when he tells everybody, serve who you want to serve, but as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. So he was about to die, and he gathered Israel all back together again because they had not quite been as successful as they could have been, because he sent everyone to take their own inheritance, and they weren't all doing it. So there was a time while he was leading the army of the collective army, and they had victory after victory after victory. Then they reached a point where they had annihilated most of the major cities, and Joshua then says, now, okay, we want you as individual tribes to go and take your own fully eliminate the enemies that are in your tribe so that you can have your land in peace. And so the tribes would split up. Often you would see them pair up. So maybe Judah and Simon or Simeon or Judah and Benjamin or something. They would pair up together if they were right next to each other, and they would go help eliminate the land, right? And so you would see different pairings sometimes, but you don't really see too often at this point the entire nation coming together again like they did in the beginning when they were crossing in. And so Joshua sees that everybody is not really taking their land like they should have. And so he calls everybody back and reminds them of the covenant before he dies as a way of saying, you need to go in and take this stuff before it's too late, basically. And so that is recapped in Judges chapter 2. So it's expanded on. You get the full story in Joshua 24, but it is recapped in Judges chapter 2, which means then that Judges chapter 2 kind of is a little bit of a backtrack, because Judges chapter 1 is taking place after the death of Joshua and talking about how in those first generation they had some more battles to fight. And then chapter 2 kind of stepped back again to Joshua's final call there while he's still alive. So it's not in chronological order. Chapter 1 is not, and that's a very Hebrew way of writing. If you don't know that, Eastern and Western styles of writing are different. So the Hebrews, the Middle East, would be what's considered an Eastern style of writing, whereas now we're in the West. And so they had two kind of styles of writing where they would often not matter so much about chronology as much as it would be the point that they're trying to make. So they could come from here and make this point, and they may not be in chronological order. There's times when Saul, that story that we just read, in fact, of Saul's, when he gets there, the Bible goes through all this stuff, how he doesn't know Samuel, and then Samuel walks past them and all this, and then it backtracks, and it goes back a couple of days to a time before Saul had been started doing any of this stuff, and God spoke to Samuel and said, I'm going to cause this young man to show up at this city, right? Which there's a whole lesson in that. I think that here is Saul traveling from place to place, thinking he's doing all of this by his own will, right? That he's making the choice to let's go here and look for the donkeys, let's go here and look for the donkeys. And then they stop, and his servant says, why don't we go into town and ask this man of God? And all the while, if you were to ask Saul and his servant, they would have thought that they were making choices based out of their own will, that they had freedom of choice, right? We all think that we have freedom of choice, that the life I'm living is a result of my choices. But it's interesting that God had, then it goes to the scene with Samuel and God in prayer days before, and God says, I'm going to cause him to show up here, right? At exactly this time, at exactly this day, he's going to be here. I want you to go out there and meet him, right? And so who was really making his choices, right? It's kind of an interesting thought that from Saul's perspective as a person, he's the one that's responsible for his own decisions. But 3 days before, God says, listen, I'm going to bring him here. He's going to be here. I want you to meet him when he gets here, right? And so that happens with us sometimes. We assume that because we only have our perspective that the choices we make are ours. But the Bible says that all things work together for the good of them that love the Lord and are the called according to his purpose. So that means that really God is running the show, right? And so it is a mystery in some ways how we have free choice, but yet God is still running the show, right? So, I mean, there's not a real easy way to understand that because we only have our perspective. And so the missing key to that is God's perspective, right? That's what we don't know, is how does God see these things? And that's why whenever you run into a mystery about that kind of stuff, it's because we're human and we don't have God's ability to understand and to see. And so we always figure, well, how could that be? How could I have free choice and yet God is still running the show? And the reason that's so hard for us to comprehend is because we don't have the benefit of knowing how mighty he really is, and to understand his perspective. So anyways, here in Judges, we get to this place in chapters 1 and 2 where it's kind of a little bit of a backtrack. And so I want to talk about a couple of things here. And so the reason I wanted to highlight the backtrack is because some of the stuff that happened with Caleb was probably right in this same time, right? So it's not way after Joshua because they were contemporaries, right? They were around at the same time. And so these events of Caleb's life, I think, are kind of interesting. And so I want to show you something real quick. Let's go to Genesis. I knew we'd get to Genesis. All right. Let's go to Genesis chapter 15. Just to lay the foundation here of what we're going to look at. So this is God talking to Abraham, okay? And this is when God promises him the promised land, right? That's why it becomes the promised land. That's where we get that name, is because here God promises it to Abraham, okay? And so in it, he tells him the nations that he's going to drive out for his people, right? And he gives them a list of the nations that are going to be driven out when they get to the promised land, right? This is Genesis 15, verse 18 through 20. And on that day that the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. Which that's interesting, it says from the river of Egypt, that's the Nile. Which is way back into Egyptian territory is what God's saying, you can have. Because the Nile is way farther back even than the Red Sea that they crossed. And so God says, I'll give your people from the Nile to the Euphrates, and Euphrates then is just as far almost the other way on the other side of the Jordan, right? And so it's really a very kind of big thing that God starts him off with here. And he says, and I would say that the closest, if they did that, would be Solomon, right? Because Solomon's empire was very expansive. And so if they ever hit these extreme boundaries, it's only during the life of Solomon. Any other time, they would not have been wide enough as a nation to have hit the extreme of what God said they could have. But I just want to read these nations to you. It says, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadamites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Right? So these are the nations that God says, I will drive out for your people. Couple of things to note. The Kenites, that is actually the tribe that Moses' in-laws came from. Right, Jethro and all of them. That's those people, right? So that's that part. And then one other thing: any major enemy that you notice is not even mentioned here. When God says, "I will thoroughly drive them out," it's a very famous enemy that Israel fights repeatedly, particularly during the time of David. The Philistines, yes, the Philistines. They're not even mentioned in there. And interestingly enough, they never were driven out either. They stayed. So that's kind of an interesting thing, that God never mentions driving out the Philistines. And then one other group is the Kenizzites. You see that as the second one there? The Kenizzites? That's kind of an interesting group. Turn with me to Numbers chapter 32. Numbers 32, and we'll be in verse 12. And this is talking about the spies. And it says, none except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite. So he's talking about how no one gave a good report out of the spies except for Joshua and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite. 32:12. And so the neat thing is that apparently Caleb was not a full Israelite, is the implication here. That now he somehow represented the tribe of Judah, so perhaps his mother was an Israelite, that this Kenizzite married in. That happened. And so, but it is kind of interesting that Caleb is described as a Kenizzite, or at least his father was a Kenizzite. And so presumably then his mother must have been from the tribe of Judah if he was selected to represent the tribe of Judah. And then let me show you one other thing. Go to Joshua chapter 14. And you might have read this before, but maybe now by seeing how it's talking about him being a Kenizzite, you might read it a little different. Joshua 14. So that's right before Judges, Joshua 14. And we'll be in the 14th verse. This is talking about the inheritance that Caleb was given, right? Caleb, the son of the Kenizzite. It says, "Therefore Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, to this day, because he wholly followed the Lord, the God of Israel." It's interesting that it says he was given this, even though he's a Kenizzite, because he wholly followed the God of Israel. And so if you just read over that and you just assume he was only an Israelite, then you don't really catch maybe the full implication of that. It seems like what that text is saying is that his father was a Kenizzite, one of the enemies of the land, in fact. But he was given grace because he fully followed the Lord, the God of Israel. And so that sheds just a little different light on the story of Joshua and Caleb that you might not have ever noticed before, which would then mean that both of these spies were only half Israelite, because Joshua was half Egyptian because he's from Ephraim, and here's Caleb who's half Kenizzite, which was the enemies of the land. So the two enemies, the enemies which was Egypt before they left, and the Kenizzites, the people that they're supposed to be throwing out, the two spies that were faithful were half of one enemy and half of the other. But because they were faithful to the Lord, God blessed them, and all of these full-blooded Israelites died in the wilderness. But these two men were given favor, and it's just kind of interesting that 14:14, it sounds like what he's saying is he's a Kenizzite, but he was given a full inheritance because he fully followed the Lord, right? And then the other verse for that would be Joshua 15:13, that very next chapter. It says, "According to the commandment of the Lord to Joshua." So in other words, God told him to do this, right? So this is not just some regular, inheritance that everybody else got. This is something specifically that God told to Joshua to do. He says, "According to the commandment of the Lord to Joshua, he gave to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, a portion among the people of Judah." Right? So it's just kind of interesting. Like when you read that, if you just assume he's full Judah, then you don't really think too much about that. But now that you realize his father was a Kenizzite, and you read that and it says that God commanded Joshua to give Caleb a portion among the people of Judah, you kind of hear that just a little differently, So it's kind of interesting. Yeah, and so it's just kind of interesting to see time after time after time, the heroes are faulty from the classical standpoint. Rahab the prostitute, Joshua half Egyptian, Caleb half Canaanite, different. Moses the wandering murderer, that David the shepherd boy, overlooked by even his own family, right? Solomon, the son of the adulterous affair, right? Sometimes we forget that we think of how great Solomon was, but he was the son of the adulterous affair. It wasn't the first son, that first son died, but it was still that adulterous thing, and then they became married, but and Solomon was the son out of that. David had children by different wives that conceivably would have been more holy choices if you wanted to choose the son to raise up. But God chose to be glorified through the mistakes even, right? So that's just another example of those.